The spring rains had finally ceased, leaving the vast expanse of the Triple Creek territory awash in a vibrant, aching green that hurt the eyes if one stared too long at the horizon. The mud was deep, a sucking, heavy clay that clung to the hooves of the horses and the boots of the men who worked the land. But to Arthur Thorne, it was the smell of money and promise. He sat atop his bay gelding, a man cut from the same rugged cloth as the hills that bordered his property, watching the morning mist burn off the south pasture. He was a man of few needs and fewer words, wealthy beyond the understanding of the townspeople 3 hours' ride away, yet he lived with a Spartan discipline that bordered on asceticism. His hands, gloved in worn leather, rested easily on the pommel of his saddle, broad and calloused from years of building an empire out of dust and stubbornness. He was not a man who sought company. The silence of the high plains was the only conversation he usually required. Arthur turned his mount toward the peripheral ridge, a stretch of land he hadn't inspected since the last frost melted. It was rocky terrain, less suited for cattle and more for the coyotes and the wind, but it was his, and he kept a mental inventory of every fence post and watershed. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth, a restorative perfume that cleared the mind of the clutter of ledgers and cattle prices. As he crested the rise, the rhythm of the horse's gait steady beneath him, something caught his eye that broke the seamless pattern of the landscape. A thin ribbon of smoke, pale gray against the azure sky, curled upward from the hollow where the old Miller cabin stood. The structure had been abandoned for a decade, a rotting husk of timber that Arthur had intended to burn down years ago to prevent squatters, though he had never found the time. He frowned, a deepening of the lines around his eyes, and nudged the gelding forward. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant presence. In a land where isolation was the primary law, an uninvited guest was a complication he had not budgeted for in his morning routine. He did not hurry. He simply moved with the inevitability of a storm front, descending the slope to see who had dared to claim sanctuary on his ground. The cabin was in a sorry state, leaning drunkenly to the west, its roof a patchwork of moss and missing shingles. Yet as Arthur drew closer, he noticed subtle alterations that spoke of recent industry. The path leading to the door, usually choked with thistle and creeper, had been cleared, the earth swept clean and packed down. There was a patch of overturned soil near the rotting porch, dark and ready for seed, a hopeful scar on the neglected land. He pulled the bay to a halt 20 yards out, the leather of his saddle creaking in the silence. It was then that the door opened, not with a bang, but with a cautious, deliberate slowness. A woman stepped out, and for a moment Arthur forgot the speech of eviction he had been formulating in his mind. She was Chinese, perhaps 27 years old, standing framed by the dark, weathered wood like a portrait forgotten by time. She wore a prairie dress of light blue, the color of a robin's egg, though the fabric was faded and frayed at the hem, speaking of many washings and long travels. It was a garment that did not belong in the mud and the grit of the frontier, yet she wore it with a straight-backed dignity that defied her obvious poverty. She held a wicker basket against her hip, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle, but her face remained impassive. She did not run, nor did she cry out. She simply watched him, her dark eyes tracking his movement with the wariness of a deer that knows the hunter is near but refuses to bolt until the first shot is fired. The wind picked up, rustling the hem of that blue dress and pulling a strand of jet-black hair from her loose bun, whipping it across her face. She brushed it away with a slow, controlled movement. Arthur sat high above her, a looming figure of authority in a shearling coat and wide-brimmed hat, the owner of the earth beneath her feet. Yet the silence that stretched between them felt heavy, balanced on a fulcrum of unexpected recognition. He saw not a trespasser but a survivor, someone attempting to coax life from a place that had long since surrendered to decay. Arthur swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the damp ground with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the small clearing. He did not approach the porch immediately. Instead, he tethered the gelding to a low-hanging branch of a scrub oak, taking his time to adjust the stirrup leather, giving her a moment to measure him as he had measured her. When he finally turned, he walked to the edge of the cleared yard and stopped, removing his hat out of reflex rather than cordiality. The woman had not moved, though her grip on the basket had tightened until the tendons in her forearm were visible. She was slight, almost fragile in appearance, but there was a steeliness in her posture that Arthur recognized. It was the stance of someone who had nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. "This is Triple Creek land," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble, akin to distant thunder, stripped of malice but heavy with fact. He did not shout. He rarely found it necessary. The statement hung in the cool spring air. The woman nodded once, a sharp, concise dip of her chin. "I know," she replied. Her voice was soft, accented but clear, carrying a timbre that sounded like wind moving through dry reeds. "The door was open. The roof leaks." It was a strange defense, an admission of trespassing coupled with a critique of the property's maintenance. Arthur looked up at the roof, noting the fresh patches where pieces of bark and flattened tin had been meticulously placed to divert the spring rains. He looked back at her garden plot, then at the single window which had been scrubbed clean of years of grime. She wasn't just hiding here. She was tending to the place. "You have a name?" Arthur asked, his gaze returning to her face. He noticed the shadows under her eyes, the hollow of her cheek that spoke of hunger, yet her gaze was level. "Lynn," she said. "My name is Lynn." "I'm Thorne," he stated, "owner of the roof that leaks." He waited for her to beg, to offer a story of woe about how she ended up alone in a shack miles from civilization, but Lynn offered nothing. She stood in her light blue dress, shivering slightly as the breeze cooled, waiting for his judgment. She did not ask for mercy. That, more than anything, stayed his hand. He looked at the axe leaning against the wall, a rusted, dull thing she must have found in the debris. She had been chopping wood with a blunt instrument, a labor twice as hard as it needed to be. "You can't stay here," he said, testing the waters. "I have nowhere else," Lynn answered simply. It wasn't a plea, it was a geography lesson. She gestured vaguely to the east, toward the town. "They do not rent to me. The road is long." Arthur looked at her hands. They were red from the cold and rough from work, not the hands of a beggar. He put his hat back on, tugging the brim down to shield his eyes from the climbing sun. He had every right to run her off, to protect his liability, to keep his borders secure. But the ranch was vast, and the cabin was useless to him. "Don't start any big fires," Arthur said, turning back toward his horse, "and fix that step before you break a leg on it." He mounted the gelding without looking back, leaving her standing in the yard. He felt the weight of her gaze on his back as he rode away, a strange heat that lingered long after he had crossed the ridge. He told himself it was pragmatism. He didn't have the time to escort a woman to town today. But as he rode, he found himself thinking of the dull axe and the patch of turned earth. 2 days later, the sky threatened rain again, a bruising purple wall of clouds moving in from the north. Arthur had spent the morning dealing with a dispute over water rights with a neighbor, a tiresome affair of paperwork and circular arguments that left him craving the simplicity of physical labor. He found himself loading a buckboard wagon, not with feed for the cattle, but with supplies from the ranch storehouse. He moved with a methodical efficiency, tossing in a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a side of cured bacon, and a heavy wool blanket. On top of the pile, he placed a grindstone and a box of nails. He told the stable hand he was checking the fence line near the gorge, a lie that tasted unfamiliar on his tongue, as Arthur Thorne was a man who prided himself on transparency. The ride to the Miller cabin was slow, the wagon wheels groaning over the uneven ruts of the trail. When he arrived, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and coming rain. Lynn was outside again, on her knees in the dirt, wrestling with a stubborn root in her garden patch. The light blue dress was smudged with dark earth at the hem. She stood as the wagon clattered into the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression guarded. She did not smile. Smiles were currency, and they had not yet established an exchange rate. Arthur pulled the brake and wrapped the reins, stepping down. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked to the back of the wagon and hefted the sack of flour onto his shoulder. He carried it to the porch and set it down on a dry plank, then returned for the rest. Lynn watched him, stepping aside as he moved past her, her eyes widening slightly at the amount of goods. When he placed the grindstone on the porch, he finally looked at her. "Tool needs an edge if you're going to work," he said, nodding toward the rusted axe still leaning against the wall. "I cannot pay for this," Lynn said, her voice tight. She looked at the food, then at him, a flicker of panic behind the stoicism. "I have no coin, Mr. Thorne." "Didn't ask for coin," Arthur grunted. He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a hammer and a pry bar. He walked over to the broken porch step he had criticized 2 days prior. "Labor pays for board. That's the rule on this ranch. You fix the house, you keep the rain off. But you can't fix it if you starve first." He knelt and began to pry the rotted wood loose. The sound of splintering timber cracked through the quiet. Lynn stood frozen for a moment, processing the transaction. It was a contract, unspoken but binding. He was not giving her charity. He was giving her employment of a sort. Dignity remained intact. She moved then, not to the food, but to the rain barrel. She dipped a tin cup and brought it to him, setting it silently on the floorboards near his hand. Then she picked up the grindstone and sat on the edge of the porch, pulling the axe onto her lap. The rhythmic shh, shh, shh of stone against metal soon harmonized with the thud, thud of his hammer. They worked in tandem, separated by culture and circumstance, but united by the universal language of repair. The rain began to fall, soft and cold, but under the overhang of the porch, the air grew warm with the heat of their shared industry. The spring storms brought with them the necessary chores of the season, checking the herds for new calves and ensuring the swelling creeks didn't wash out the crossings. Arthur found his days fuller than usual, yet his internal compass kept drifting toward the hollow where the cabin stood. He told himself he was merely supervising an asset, ensuring the squatter wasn't burning the place down. But the truth was found in the silence of his evenings. The ranch house, with its high ceilings and empty rooms, felt cavernous. The cabin, with its leaking roof and the woman in the blue dress, felt alive. A week after he had brought the supplies, Arthur rode out to the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the grass, turning the mud into bronze. As he approached, he saw Lynn struggling with a heavy wooden shutter that had blown loose in the wind. She was standing on an overturned crate, stretching on tiptoes, trying to hammer a pin back into place, but she lacked the height and the leverage. The hammer slipped from her grip, clattering to the ground. She let out a frustrated breath, her shoulders slumping. Arthur rode up, the hoofbeats muffled by the soft ground. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, walking up behind her. He didn't speak. He simply picked up the hammer, reached up with his considerable height, and drove the pin home with 2 solid strikes. The shutter held fast. Lynn turned on the crate, finding herself nearly eye to level with him. For the first time, he saw the color of her eyes clearly, a deep obsidian brown that held a spark of fierce intelligence. She was close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and wild mint on her skin. She did not step down immediately. "The wind is strong here," she said, her voice steady despite the proximity. "It tests everything," Arthur replied, looking at the shutter rather than her eyes. "If it's weak, it breaks. If it's strong, it stays." "I am still here," Lynn said quietly. "So you are," Arthur agreed. He stepped back, giving her space to descend. He had brought a sack of seed potatoes, left over from the main planting. He gestured to them on his saddle. "Ground's ready. These need to go in before the next rain." "I will plant them," she said. She hesitated, then added, "The roof, in the corner. It still drips." "I'll bring a tarp," he said, "or some shingles." "I can cut shingles," she countered, "if I have the wood. The axe is sharp now." Arthur looked at her hands. They were scraped, the nails broken, but strong. She wanted to do the work herself. She wanted to owe him nothing but the materials. He respected that more than he could articulate. "Cedar," he said. "There's a fallen cedar by the creek. I'll drag it up for you." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Arthur," he corrected, the name slipping out before he could stop it. "Name's Arthur." She looked at him, a slight softening at the corners of her mouth, the ghost of a smile she was not yet ready to spend. "Arthur," she repeated, testing the weight of it. "I will have tea ready when you bring the wood." It was a small thing, a cup of tea in a wilderness of mud and cattle, but as Arthur rode toward the creek to find the cedar, the prospect of it felt more significant than the 1,000 head of cattle bearing his brand. The tenuous peace of their arrangement was shattered 3 days later by the arrival of a disruption from the outside world. Arthur was working in the main corral, branding the late calves, the air thick with the smell of singed hair and dust. His foreman, a wiry, cynical man named Vance, who had worked the territory for 20 years, rode in from the perimeter patrol with a dark look on his face. Vance was a good man with a rope, but his mind was narrow, and he viewed the world through a lens of suspicion. He reined his horse in sharply next to the fence where Arthur was tallying the herd. "We got a problem on the North Ridge, boss," Vance spat, wiping dust from his forehead. "Found a squatter in the old Miller place, a Chinese woman. Looks like she's set up shop. I told her to pack her things, said I'd be back in an hour to torch the place if she wasn't gone." Arthur felt a cold stillness settle over him, a distinct contrast to the heat of the branding iron he was holding. He handed the iron to the nearest hand and slowly pulled his gloves off. The noise of the corral seemed to fade into the background. "You told her what?" Arthur asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Told her to get," Vance said, oblivious to the shift in the air. "She's digging up the yard, living like a rat in that shack. We don't need drifters setting roots, Arthur. You know that. I figured I'd save you the trouble." Arthur walked to the gate, opened it, and stepped through. He approached Vance's horse, grabbing the bridle near the bit to hold the animal steady. He looked up at his foreman, his eyes hard as flint. "You won't be torching anything, Vance." Vance blinked, confused. "She's trespassing. It's prime land if we ever want to expand the grazing." "She's not trespassing," Arthur lied, his voice loud enough for the nearby hands to hear. "She's employed." Vance scowled. "Employed? Doing what? That shack is a ruin." "She's watching the north herd and repairing the property," Arthur stated, cementing the lie into fact. "I put her there, and I gave her permission to cultivate the garden." The silence that followed was heavy. Vance looked from Arthur to the other men, his authority checked. He shifted in his saddle, uneasy. You put a woman out there alone? A foreigner?" "She's not alone," Arthur said, the implication clear. "She's Triple Creek, and if you threatened her, you'll ride back out there and apologize. Or you can collect your wages and ride on." Vance reddened, his pride stung, but he knew better than to challenge Arthur Thorne on his own land. "I didn't know, boss. She didn't say nothing about working for you." "She doesn't waste words," Arthur said. "Saddle the roan. I'm riding out there. You're coming with me to set it straight." As they rode toward the cabin, Arthur felt a tightening in his chest. He realized that by claiming her, he had crossed a line. She was no longer a secret discovery. She was part of the ranch's ecosystem now, under his public protection. When they arrived, Lynn was standing on the porch, the axe in her hand, her knuckles white. She looked small against the vastness of the threatening world, her blue dress a target. When she saw Arthur, the tension in her shoulders dropped, just a fraction. She didn't look at Vance. She looked only at Arthur, and in that look there was an acknowledgment of safety that hit him harder than a physical blow. He had bought her safety with a lie, but looking at her, he knew he would make it the truth. Vance sat on his horse, his hat in his hands, looking at the ground rather than at the woman standing on the porch. The apology was mumbled, a rough collection of words that tasted like ash in his mouth, but he said them because Arthur Thorne was watching him with eyes that promised unemployment if he faltered. Lynn listened without expression, her face a smooth mask of composure, though her grip on the axe handle relaxed. She nodded once when Vance finished, a gesture that dismissed him rather than forgave him. When the foreman turned his horse and galloped away, eager to put distance between himself and his shame, the silence that rushed back into the clearing was heavy with the weight of what had just been spoken. Arthur did not leave immediately. He dismounted and walked to the porch, removing his gloves slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. "I told a lie," Arthur said, his voice low, addressing the weathered wood of the porch railing, "to keep the peace. I told him you were on the payroll, that you were watching the herd." Lynn looked at him, her dark eyes searching his profile. "It is a dangerous lie," she said softly. "Lies have a way of becoming debts." "Then we make it truth." Arthur turned to her, and the distance between them felt suddenly charged, the air vibrating with the shifting of tectonic plates in their arrangement. "I can't pay much, but I can pay in supplies, in protection. You watch the north fence, you keep the cabin standing, and you tell me if anyone else comes riding up here thinking they can push you around." Lynn lowered the axe, leaning it against the wall. She smoothed the front of her light blue dress, her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. "I accept the work, Arthur," she said, using his given name with a deliberate weight. "But the tea is ready, and you promised to bring the cedar." He followed her inside. It was the first time he had crossed the threshold. The interior was small, smelling of pine sap and dried sage. The floor had been swept until the wood grain shone. In the corner, a small cast-iron stove radiated heat. There was only one chair, which she offered to him, while she sat on an overturned crate. As she poured the tea into tin cups, their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of awareness through Arthur's arm, sharper than a branding iron. He watched her hands, graceful and scarred, moving in the dim light. She was no longer just a squatter or a charity case. She was the keeper of the hearth, and for the first time in years, Arthur felt the crushing loneliness of his own vast, empty ranch house. He drank the tea, which was bitter and hot, and it tasted like salvation. He stayed until the moon rose, speaking little, simply letting the rhythm of her presence settle into his bones. When he finally stood to leave, the cabin felt warmer than it had any right to be, and the ride back to the main house felt colder than he could remember. The weeks that followed brought the full force of the spring melt. The creeks swelled into raging torrents, brown and foaming, tearing at the banks and threatening the bridges. The sky was a constant sheet of slate gray, weeping rain that turned the world into a slurry of mud. Arthur was exhausted, spending his days in the saddle, moving cattle to higher ground, his slicker heavy with water, his bones aching from the damp. He had not been to the cabin in 4 days, and the absence gnawed at him, a dull ache in the center of his chest. He told himself it was concern for the property, for the employee, but he knew it was the woman. On the 5th day the rain intensified, hammering against the earth with a violence that made the cattle huddle in the scrub oak. Arthur rode out toward the north ridge, fighting the wind, his bay gelding slipping in the muck. When he crested the rise, his heart hammered against his ribs. The creek near the cabin had burst its banks, a deluge of water cutting across the lower garden. He spurred the horse forward, panic rising in his throat. He found Lynn not in the cabin, but knee-deep in the freezing, rushing water of the diversion ditch he had seen her digging weeks ago. She was struggling with a heavy log, trying to wedge it into the mud to divert the flow away from the cabin's foundation. Her blue dress was soaked black, clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her skull. She slipped, going down into the brown water, and for a terrifying second she disappeared. Arthur was off his horse before the animal had stopped moving. He splashed into the ditch, the water icy enough to steal his breath. He grabbed Lynn by the arm, hauling her up. She was gasping, coughing water, but she didn't stop. She pointed frantically at the log. "The corner!" she shouted over the roar of the rain. "It will undercut the corner!" He saw what she saw. The water was eating away at the earth beneath the porch. Without a word, he threw his weight against the log, his superior strength driving it deep into the mud, bracing it with a large stone. Together, they shoveled rocks and dirt behind the barrier, working in a frantic, muddy blur until the water was forced back into the main channel. By the time they finished, they were both covered in slime, shivering violently, their chests heaving. Arthur grabbed her shoulders, turning her to face him. Her lips were blue with cold. The fierce independence was still there in her eyes, but her body was failing her. "Inside," he ordered, his voice rough. "Now!" He practically carried her onto the porch and into the cabin. He ignored the mud he was tracking onto her clean floor. He went straight to the stove, stoking the embers into a roaring fire. Lynn stood by the table, wrapping her arms around herself, water pooling at her feet. She looked small and incredibly vulnerable. Arthur stripped off his heavy sodden coat and threw it over the back of the chair. He turned to her, and the instinct to protect overwhelmed him. He reached out, his large, warm hands cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away the muddy water from her cheeks. "You could have drowned," he whispered, the anger of fear mixing with the tenderness of relief. "The house," she chattered, her teeth clicking together. "It is my home." "It's wood and nails," he said fiercely. "You are—" He stopped, the admission caught in his throat. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned to the bed, pulling the wool blanket he had brought her weeks ago. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight, cocooning her. He rubbed her arms briskly through the wool, trying to transfer his heat to her. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, her shivering slowly subsiding. For a long moment, there was no sound but the rain on the roof and their breathing. Arthur held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, realizing that the structure he had just fought to save wasn't the cabin. It was the life she breathed into it. He knew then that he would tear down the sky before he let the cold touch her again. The storm passed, leaving the land scoured and bright. The necessity of supplies forced a trip to town, a journey Arthur usually undertook alone. This time he harnessed the team to the buckboard and waited in the yard while Lynn climbed up beside him. She wore her dress, washed and dried, though the stains of the mud remained as faint shadows on the hem. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her posture upright and proud. The ride to town was 3 hours of silence, but it was a companionable silence, filled with the observation of hawks circling in the greening of the hills. Arthur found himself pointing out landmarks, the old mine shaft, the ridge where the eagles nested, and she listened, nodding, her eyes taking in the territory that was his life. When they rolled into the settlement, heads turned. Arthur Thorne was a known entity, a man of power and solitude. To see him with a woman, and a Chinese woman at that, sparked a ripple of whispers that followed them down the boardwalk. Arthur ignored them, his jaw set in granite. He tied the horses outside the general store and offered his hand to Lynn. She hesitated, looking at the people staring from the mercantile window. "Head up," Arthur murmured, his voice for her ears only. "You walk with me." She took his hand, her grip firm, and stepped down. They walked into the store side by side. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Higgins, faltered in his greeting when he saw Lynn. "Mr. Thorne," Higgins said, wiping his hands nervously. "And Miss?" "We need flour," Arthur said, his voice filling the room, daring anyone to interrupt. "Sugar, coffee, and I need 10 yards of fabric." He looked at Lynn. "Calico, or wool, something warm." Lynn looked up at him, startled. "Arthur, no! The flour is enough." "It's not charity," he said, repeating their old dance, though his eyes were soft. "It's uniform, for the employee." He led her to the bolts of cloth. She reached out, her fingers drifting over a rich, deep burgundy wool, soft and thick. She touched it reverently, then pulled her hand back as if burned, reaching for a cheaper gray cotton. Arthur caught her wrist gently. "The red," he told Higgins. "Cut the whole bolt." As Higgins measured the cloth, a man at the counter snickered. It was a drifting ranch hand, smelling of cheap whiskey. "Thorne's got himself a pet, looks like, dressing it up." The sound in the store died instantly. Arthur turned slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply walked over to the man, towering over him, radiating a violence that was all the more terrifying for its restraint. "You'll apologize to the lady," Arthur said, "and then you'll leave this town. If I see you on Triple Creek land or anywhere near it, we won't be having a conversation." The drifter looked into Arthur's eyes and saw the abyss. He mumbled a sorry and fled. Arthur returned to the counter, paid in gold, and picked up the heavy bolt of red wool himself. He placed it in Lynn's arms. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of being seen, being defended. In the middle of the dusty store, surrounded by judgment, Arthur Thorne had just declared his allegiance to the world. Summer was beginning to bleed into the air, bringing with it the hum of insects and the scent of wild clover. The evening stretched long and purple. Arthur found himself at the cabin almost every night now. The pretense of checking the herd had evaporated. He came because he could not stay away. He chopped her wood, repaired the corral fence, and in return she cooked meals that filled the hollow with savory steam. They sat on the porch as the stars came out, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with a profound understanding. One evening, the fireflies were blinking in the tall grass. Lynn was sewing the red wool, fashioning a new dress, the needle flashing in the light of the lantern hung from the raft. Arthur sat on the step, whittling a peg for the gate, but his knife was idle. He watched her. The light caught the curve of her neck, the concentration on her face. She stopped sewing, sensing his gaze, and looked at him. "You stare, Arthur," she said quietly. "I'm looking," he corrected. "There's a difference." He stood and moved to the chair opposite her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. The distance between them was negligible. "The cabin is fixed," he said. "Roof's tight, garden is coming in. You've done what you said you'd do." "I pay my debts," Lynn said, setting the needle down. "And I pay mine," Arthur replied. "But the ledger doesn't balance." "How so?" "Because," Arthur said, his voice rough with the difficulty of words, "I go back to that big house, and it's quiet. I have 20 rooms and not a single reason to walk into any of them. I come here, to a shack I was going to burn down, and—" He paused, looking at her hands resting on the red wool. He reached out and covered her hand with his. Her skin was warm, calloused like his, a match in strength and labor. "And I feel like I'm home." Lynn turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for two souls who had been adrift. "I have never asked for more than a roof," she whispered. "I'm offering more," Arthur said. He squeezed her hand. "I'm a hard man, Lynn. I don't know how to be soft. But I know how to stand my ground. And I know that I don't want to stand there without you. She stood up, the wool falling to the floor. She stepped toward him, bold in the lantern light. She reached out and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You are not hard," she said. "You are the earth, solid, and I am tired of walking." Arthur stood, pulling her into his arms. It wasn't a desperate collision, but a coming together of two necessary parts. He held her against him, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, smoke and soap and life. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He just held her, feeling the beat of her heart against his chest, a rhythm that matched his own. The contract was broken. Something permanent had been forged in its place. The following morning the sun broke over the ridge with a clarity that promised high summer. The air was filled with the song of meadowlarks. Arthur and Lynn stood on the porch of the cabin drinking coffee. The bay gelding was saddled, grazing near the garden patch. The world felt different, sharper, brighter. "Vance will be coming by for orders at noon," Arthur said, looking out over the valley. "He will see the horses," Lynn noted. "He'll see a lot of things," Arthur said. He set his cup down on the railing. "I'm going to bring the wagon tomorrow. We'll move the heavy things, the stove, the tools." Lynn looked at him, her eyebrows raised. "Move them where?" "To the main house," Arthur said simply. "The roof there doesn't leak at all, and the kitchen is big enough for that garden you want to plant next year." "And this place?" she asked, looking back at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. "We'll keep it," Arthur said, "for when we need to remember where we started. But it's not a home, Lynn. Not for my wife." The word hung in the air, heavy and sweet. He hadn't asked, not formally, but the statement was as solid as the mountains behind them. Lynn looked at him, her eyes wide, and then a smile broke across her face. A true smile, radiant and unguarded, transforming her. "Your wife will need a better garden," she said, her voice teasing but thick with emotion. "She can have the whole damn county," Arthur growled softly, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted of coffee and promise. They stood there for a long time, watching the light flood the valley, the wealthy rancher and the survivor in the blue dress, no longer separate entities fighting the world, but a single force rooted in the land and in each other. The work would continue, the cattle, the fences, the storms, but the solitude was over. Arthur Thorne had found the only thing his money couldn't buy, and he held her hand as if it were the only anchor in the world.